Laravel Jetstream is a starter kit for your Laravel website and is packed with features that have come to be expected in modern web applications. Authentication, registration, profile management, password updates, two-factor authentication, password confirmation for added security on specific parts of your website. It even offers us the ability to allow users to create teams, which we'll use along with API key issuance in part 3 of this tutorial. Now, with all the time you'll be saving by using Jetstream, you'll be able to easily knock off those to-dos on your list and relax. Let's hop into the terminal, type the Laravel new command. We'll name our project, choose Laravel Jetstream, Livewire, team support, and dark mode, because I'm gangsta. And finally, let's use pest. We're not going to initialize a Git repository yet. All right, let's let that build, open it up in PHP Storm. Let's head into our env, update our database connection to SQLite, and then we'll add a new file called database.sqlite in our database directory. Now let's run artisan migrate. Next, let's go to config, Jetstream, and scroll down to the features array and uncomment out the API features. This will let us do API tokens from our dashboard. Next, let's hop into our browser and test things out a little bit. I'll click register. I'll add some basic information. Let's go to API tokens and test it out. Perfect. Let's hop back into our terminal and do PHP artisan make model to do. We'll do -mf. That's going to create a migration and a factory for us. Let's hop into our migration, add the following: a title, a UUID, a date time for completed at, which is nullable, and a Boolean currently working on, which defaults to false. Next, let's set up our factory. When testing your application or seeding your database, you may need to insert a few records into your database. Instead of manually specifying the value of each column, Laravel allows you to define a set of default attributes for each of your Eloquent models using model factories. Furthermore, Faker gives us a nice library that we can use to generate these attributes randomly. Let's go ahead and add our title, a UUID, which is just a random string. For our completed at, we'll use a random element from an array. The array is going to have two items, null and now, which is a date timestamp. Faker will choose one of these randomly. We'll do the same thing for currently working on, except we'll use true or false in our array. Shane from the future here, my friend Andres Santibanez reminded me about Faker's Boolean function, which lets you choose the chance of getting true 1 through 100. It's good to have friends. Back in our terminal, let's create our test. PHP artisan make test. This will be our to-do API test. Let's go ahead and run pest just to make sure everything's wired up and working like we would expect it to. Great. Inside of our test, we're going to start with a describe API. We'll set the description to API and we'll make our first test. Let's make sure that the API is even working and our API tokens are working properly. We should be able to create a user and hit the API endpoint with auth sanctum for our middleware, and then we can return the user that made the request. Great. All that's working. Let's move forward with our test. I'm going to go ahead and create a controller so that we can group all of our logic for our API endpoints into one place. I chose to create an API controller, which has logic built in for the standard CRUD operations: index, show, store, update, destroy, etc. That way, we won't have to make each one of these methods by hand. Back in our API.php, let's add a route to return the user's to-dos. Now let's update our test so that we're testing to make sure that users can get their to-dos. Whoops, it looks like I forgot to add the user ID to our factory. Actually, let's go ahead and create a test right here in the same file to make sure that users can have to-dos and that relationship exists in our application. Next, let's go into our to-do model and add our user function. This is going to return a belongs to relationship. While we're here, we'll go ahead and make sure we don't hit the mass assignment exception. Protected, guarded, ID. That'll do it for now. Let's go to our to-dos migration and we'll add the foreign ID for user model. That will automatically add a user ID column with foreign constraints. Great. All tests are passing. Back in our test, let's finish working on that test. We'll create a bunch of to-dos with the factory that we created, hit our route, and ensure that our JSON response has the data we're expecting. It looks like we're getting invalid JSON return from the route, which makes sense. We haven't set up the index function yet on our API controller. It looks like this test is still failing, which also makes sense. We didn't set our to-dos relationship on our user model. Let's go to user and add a to-dos function. This is going to return a has many relationship. Let's run our tests again. Awesome. Looks like it's returning the data. Let's clean up our test to make sure that we're returning the data that we are expecting. We'll assert that the status is at 200 and that the JSON has a data node with all of the user's to-dos. This is actually failing. I dug around the Laravel docs a little bit and I realized that I wanted to use the assertable JSON class instead. Let's update our code to that. Again, we'll assert that the status is 200, that the JSON has to-dos, and that there are 5 to-dos returned in that array. Great, now that test is passing. Let's go ahead and duplicate this test, rename it, and make sure that now we can create to-dos in our database via the API. Let's add a new route for post. This is going to hit the store method in our to-do controller. To handle the validation, I'm going to go ahead and create a custom form request. This will handle validation. Let's go to our terminal. PHP artisan, make request, store to-do request. Now, with the magic of dependency injection, anything that comes into this function will have already gone through those validation rules defined in that request. I also want to make sure that on the store method, we're returning all of the user's to-dos and a status code of 201 created. Now, let's go into the store to-do request, turn authorization to always return true, and add our validation rules. Let's also not forget to run validation on our request. Validated equals request validated. The validated method returns an array of properties if it passes validation. Since it's an array, we can pass it right into the create method on to-dos. Now let's run pest. All green. Now that we know that our user can get all of their to-dos and they can create a to-do, let's make sure that the validation works as well. If we don't pass a title or UUID, we should assert that we're getting a validation error response in the JSON. Also, validation errors return a status code of 422. Let's run our test again and make sure that we're all green. Great. Let's copy the test, changing title to UUID, and another test we're completed at and currently working on. We'll make an assertion that the status code that's returned is a 201, and now the database has the to-do that we just passed into the route. Let's run our test. Green. That wraps it up for our creation tests. Now let's add a route for editing a post. To-dos, we'll pass in the UUID, and this is going to hit our update method on our to-do controller. Let's duplicate our test and change the name. To test editing, we're going to create a to-do in the database with our factory. We're going to look up that to-do and set it as this variable called already created. Next, we're going to hit our API/todos/ the UUID of the already created to-do /edit. All we need to do is pass it a different title than what we created originally, and assert that once it goes through this endpoint, the title in the database is the new one that we just set for that to-do. Let's head over to our to-do controller and go to our update method. We're going to do the validation inline here. Validated equals request validate, and then an array of rules. Since the validate method returns an array of data, we can simply pass that into our update method on our to-do model. Next, let's make sure our users can delete to-dos. Let's create a user, give him, let's say, 5 to-dos, grab the first one out of the database, and with the delete HTTP verb, pass it to our API. We'll assert that the status is 200 and that the database only has 4 to-dos. Let's go to our API and add this delete method. That's going to hit the destroy method on our controller. And all we have to do is force delete on the to-do. Let's run our test. All green. I just realized something pretty important. We're not ensuring that we're using Sanctum tokens or API keys when making our API calls. The second parameter in our acting as method will accept a guard. All we have to do is pass Sanctum, replace this on each one of our tests, rerun our test, and we're still green. Let's continue. Additionally, I want to clean up our test by using named routes instead of statically typed routes. Let's go ahead and update each one of our tests and then jump into our API.php and add names for each one of our routes. Run the test. Great. Let's go. In part of the native PHP app, I want to be able to see who all of our other teammates are, how many to-dos they currently have in the system, and how many have been completed. So we're going to need a team controller to handle all of our API logic in responding to team requests. API resources are really quite nice in Laravel. This rabbit hole can go a bit deeper than this tutorial will demonstrate, but for now, let's just stick with an API resource collection, which will return an array of model instances and a single API resource, which will let us define what data to return when querying a single model instance. Let's take a really close look at our team resource. All I want to return when anybody's looking at a single member of a team is the ID of the user, their name, how many total to-dos they have, and how many completed to-dos they have. So by defining each of these indexes inside of the return array, we can tell the API exactly what we want to return. Just for demonstration purposes, I went ahead and created a route inside of my web.php. This is going to hit our team controller index method. The index method is returning a team resource collection of the authenticated user's current team all users. It's taking the currently logged in user, grabbing the current team that they're on, and then getting all of the users that belong to that team and returning it into this team resource collection. The team resource collection is just returning this collection. where each member inside of the array that's returned, or user in this example, is defined in the team resource. Taking a look in the browser, we can see that we have data, which is an array of all of the users or my current team. We have the ID, the name, the total to-dos, and the completed to-dos. Just to give you a bit more of an example, not that I would actually use this on the API, but if I add another item here, and let's have that return this, created at, format, in the nice way, we should be able to see that right here. Poking around in the Laravel documents, I came across this conditional relationship. This is our team resource currently. We have name, total to-dos, completed to-dos, and obviously the ID. Now, it wouldn't make much sense to show all of each user's to-dos when requesting all of the team members on our team. However, if we want to look at a single team member, we do want to load the to-dos so we can get the title and other data about each to-do. Behind the scenes, I went and created another resource for our to-dos. That's just going to give us the ID, the title, the UUID, whether or not it's completed, and whether or not each one is being worked on. Because we have this when loaded to-dos, it's actually not going to show us any of those to-dos. However, in other instances, we might want to show a single user and all their, so we can load to-dos into the collection and return all of our to-do resource for each user. Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's go ahead and make some tests. I created a team test. Before each test runs, I want to make sure we have a user, a second user. We're going to switch the first user to a new team, a company team. We'll attach the second user to the same team. We'll switch the second user to another team, and then assert that both of them are on the same team. Then we'll make sure that we're using the sanctum guard and acting as that first user. Our first test will be to see that the user can see the other team members and how many to-dos they have. We'll hit our API team index route and assert that the status is 200. There's a data node, and that array has 2 items inside of it. One for each user. Back in our API routes, let's add another route to show a single team user's to-do. Give it a name. Let's go back into our controller and define that show method. Pretty simple. We'll just return a new team resource for that user, loading their to-dos. Now let's make a test. A user's to-dos can be returned from the API. We'll grab that second user in the database, hit the api.team.show endpoint, assert the status is 200, and then we can assert that the JSON has data, and that inside of data we have an ID, a to-dos, total to-dos, completed to-dos, and then we'll use this etc. method. Run our tests. Green. Well, that takes care of everything we're going to need for now from our API. I sure hope you had as much fun working on this as I did making it. Thanks for sticking with me. If you enjoy this kind of content and you want to see more Laravel tutorials like this, please like the video, subscribe to my channel, and make some comments below about some things that you would like to see. On our next episode, we're going to jump back into our native PHP app and start ingesting this new API that we made. Stay tuned.